Hello there and welcome to Biology for Sleep, where curiosity slows down, thoughts loosen their grip, and science becomes something you can rest inside rather than wrestle with. This is a place for long explanations, gentle pacing, and ideas that don't demand anything from you. A place where learning doesn't rush, and where it's perfectly fine if your attention drifts in and out like a tide. Tonight's topic is one many of us recognize, even if we don't always name it out loud. It's about the quiet pull that draws us back to the same behaviors again and again. The snack we reach for without thinking. The app we open even when we promised ourselves we wouldn't. The habit that lives in the background, waiting patiently for a moment of stress, boredom, or fatigue. Addiction is often imagined as something extreme or distant, but in truth, it exists on a spectrum. It lives in small, everyday loops just as much as in life-altering struggles. It's the feeling of knowing something isn't helping and still returning to it. Not because you want to suffer, not because you lack willpower, but because something inside your nervous system has learned a pattern that feels necessary. This isn't a story about failure or moral weakness. It's a story about how brains learn, how bodies adapt, and how repetition reshapes the machinery that drives behavior. It's about why stopping is rarely as simple as deciding. And it's about how the urge to return isn't a flaw in your character, but a consequence of systems that evolved to keep you alive in a very different world. If you find this kind of exploration calming, if you enjoy letting your thoughts wander while something steady unfolds in the background, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this quiet corner reach others who might need something gentle at the end of the day. Now, let your shoulders settle a little. Let your breathing find its own pace. You don't need to focus sharply on every word. The rhythm is slow on purpose. You can listen in fragments. You can drift. The ideas will still be here. Addiction doesn't begin with chaos. It usually begins with relief. At first, there is a moment where something eases. Tension drops, discomfort softens. A feeling shifts just enough to be noticeable. That change is small, but the brain is very good at noticing changes. It evolved to track what improves survival. Food after hunger, warmth after cold, safety after threat. These transitions are registered deeply, because in an uncertain environment, remembering what helps can mean the difference between living and not. Modern addictions often grow from this same machinery. The brain does not distinguish between berries in the wild and notifications on a screen. It does not know the difference between shelter from a storm and the chemical quiet that comes from a drink, a pill, a scroll, or a bite of sugar. It only tracks patterns. Something happened, the body state improved. Mark this, remember this, return here. The first repetition is rarely dramatic. It feels ordinary. Maybe even reasonable. You were tired, and something made it easier to get through the evening. You were anxious, and something took the edge off. You were bored, and something filled the space. The nervous system quietly records the sequence. State, action, relief. This is how loops begin. Not as traps, but as solutions. Over time, the brain becomes faster at predicting. It learns to anticipate. Before the discomfort fully forms, the idea of relief appears, not as a conscious plan, but as a sensation, a pull, a subtle nudge in a familiar direction. You don't always notice the moment it starts. Often, you only become aware once you're already halfway through the behavior. This is not accidental. The systems involved operate below language. They are older than reasoning. They exist to reduce uncertainty and conserve energy. Once a path proves reliable, the brain prefers it, not because it is good, but because it is known. Every repetition strengthens the root. Neurons that fire together begin to coordinate. Circuits become efficient. The distance between urge and action shortens. What once required thought becomes automatic. The behavior moves from effortful choice into the realm of habit. And habits feel like part of the environment. They stop announcing themselves. They simply happen. At this stage, many people become confused by their own actions. They wonder why they keep returning to something they understand intellectually to be harmful or unhelpful. The gap between knowing and doing feels personal, as if something inside is broken. What's actually happening is that two systems are now operating at different speeds. The reflective mind can evaluate outcomes, it can weigh long-term consequences, it can imagine alternatives. But the habit system does not speak in futures. It speaks in patterns, it responds to cues, it moves quickly, often before conscious thought has time to intervene. When stress rises, when energy drops, when attention weakens, control shifts toward the faster system. The one that does not ask whether this is wise, the one that only asks whether it has worked before. This is why willpower alone so often fails. Not because the person lacks discipline, but because discipline lives in a slower layer of the brain. It requires resources. It depends on sleep, nutrition, emotional stability, and safety. Under strain, it fades. The older machinery remains. Addiction persists, not because you forget what it costs, but because the body remembers what it once provided. And that memory is stored in sensation, not in language. It is carried in changes in heart rate, in muscle tone, in the way breathing shifts. It is carried in the chemistry of expectation. The body begins to prepare for relief before it arrives. The anticipation itself becomes part of the loop. Over time, the absence of the behavior can feel like a problem in itself, not because something is missing in the world, but because the nervous system has adjusted its baseline. What once felt neutral now feels like deprivation. The body is no longer returning to zero. It is returning to discomfort. This is how a coping strategy becomes a requirement. It is also why shame does nothing to break the cycle. Shame adds stress. Stress activates the very systems that drive the urge. The loop tightens. Understanding this does not instantly dissolve addiction, but it changes the frame. It replaces moral language with biological clarity. It shifts the question from "why can't I stop?" to "what has my nervous system learned to depend on?" And once that question is asked, a different kind of change becomes possible. Not force, not self-punishment, but retraining. Because the brain learned this pattern, and what is learned can, slowly, be learned differently. The loop did not form in a moment. It will not dissolve in one either. It unwinds through repetition just as it formed, through new experiences of safety, through new ways of meeting discomfort, through rebuilding tolerance for states that once felt unbearable. This takes time in the literal biological sense. Circuits weaken when they are not used. New ones grow when they are practiced. The brain is plastic throughout life, not infinitely flexible, but always capable of adjustment. The urge is not an enemy. It is a signal from a system that learned too well. And that system does not respond to arguments. It responds to experience, which means the path forward is not about erasing desire, but about changing what the body believes will help. And to understand how that belief forms so powerfully, it helps to look more closely at the machinery that drives it, beginning with the way familiarity itself becomes comforting even when it no longer serves you. Familiarity is one of the nervous system's most powerful signals of safety. Long before language, long before deliberate thought, organisms learned that what has happened before without harm is more predictable than what has never been tried. Predictability reduces energy expenditure. It allows the body to relax. It lowers the constant scanning for threat that would otherwise exhaust the system. In an uncertain environment, the known path is the safer one, even if it is not ideal. This is why habits form so easily. Once a sequence of events produces a tolerable outcome, the brain begins to treat it as a reliable option. It does not evaluate whether the outcome is optimal. It only records that the outcome was survivable, manageable, or relieving. The nervous system is not designed to pursue fulfillment. It is designed to minimize danger. When a behavior becomes familiar, it becomes efficient. The motor patterns refine. The timing becomes automatic. The emotional response attached to the behavior stabilizes. The brain no longer has to calculate, it simply initiates. This efficiency feels like comfort. Not pleasure in the usual sense, but the absence of uncertainty. A familiar pattern does not require vigilance. It does not require decision-making. It does not demand that the brain simulate multiple futures. It simply unfolds. That reduction in cognitive load is experienced as ease, and ease, in a stressed organism, is valuable. This is why people often return to habits that no longer bring pleasure. The comfort is no longer in the effect, it is in the predictability of the sequence. The body knows what will happen next. It knows how to prepare. It knows how to settle into the rhythm. Even if the outcome is unsatisfying, the path is known. Unfamiliar alternatives, even healthier ones, feel unstable. They lack a stored pattern. They require attention. They introduce uncertainty. The nervous system must remain alert. For a brain already taxed by stress, this feels costly. From the inside, this is often interpreted as resistance to change. From the outside, it can look like self-sabotage. But from the perspective of the body, it is risk management. Consider how quickly the body learns to associate environments with behaviors. A certain chair becomes linked to scrolling. A particular room becomes linked to drinking. A time of day becomes linked to snacking. These associations are not formed through reasoning. They are formed through repetition in context. The hippocampus tracks location. The amygdala tracks emotional significance. The basal ganglia track action sequences. Together they create a map. When a cue appears, the map activates. The body begins preparing for the next step before you are consciously aware of deciding. This is why cravings often feel sudden. They are not sudden, they are triggered. The sight of a place, the feeling of fatigue, a specific emotion, a social situation. These cues activate stored loops. The body shifts state. Salivation may increase. Heart rate may change. Attention narrows. The urge emerges as a bodily sensation. At this point, the behavior is no longer just something you do. It is something your body expects. Breaking a pattern at this stage feels like walking into a dark room without knowing where the furniture is. The nervous system tightens, muscles brace, attention sharpens. The brain must stay online. This is tiring. Familiar patterns conserve energy. This is one reason why change is hardest when life is already demanding. The more strained the system, the more it clings to what is known. In times of uncertainty, people regress to older habits, not because they are regressing psychologically, but because the body is prioritizing predictability. Addictive patterns often become the most stable structures in an otherwise unstable landscape. They are reliable, they are available, they do not depend on other people, they do not require negotiation, they do not surprise. For someone whose life contains chaos, inconsistency, or threat, this reliability can feel like an anchor. The behavior becomes less about pleasure and more about control, not conscious control, but physiological control, a way to regulate state, a way to move from agitation to numbness, from emptiness to stimulation, from tension to release. The nervous system does not label this as harmful. It labels it as effective. Over time, the original relief may fade, tolerance develops, the effect becomes weaker, the cost increases, but the pattern remains because the association between cue and action has been strengthened by hundreds or thousands of repetitions. Each repetition deepens the groove. Neural pathways are not fixed tracks, but they become easier to travel the more often they are used. Myelin thickens around frequently activated circuits. Signal transmission becomes faster. Competing pathways become comparatively inefficient. This is why habits feel automatic. It is not a metaphor. It is a structural change. When someone attempts to stop, the absence of the familiar sequence creates a gap. The body enters a state it does not recognize. There is no stored response for this configuration of cues without the behavior. The system becomes alert. Stress hormones rise. The mind begins searching for resolution. This is often interpreted as craving. But craving is not just desire. It is the nervous system signaling that a known regulatory tool is unavailable. The discomfort is not merely psychological, it is physiological. Heart rate variability changes, cortisol levels shift. The body moves toward a state it associates with instability. At this point, returning to the habit is not about seeking pleasure. It is about restoring equilibrium. This is why people often describe relapses happening before they realize what they're doing. The body moves first, the mind follows. Familiarity does not just feel comfortable, it feels necessary. This also explains why people can become attached to patterns that actively harm them. If a behavior reliably produces a known internal state, even a negative one, it may be preferable to unpredictability. For a nervous system shaped by instability, predictability itself is safety. Some individuals grow up in environments where danger is constant. Their baseline is hypervigilance. In such systems, even harmful patterns can feel regulating. The body learns that chaos is normal. It learns that calm is unfamiliar. Later in life, when safety becomes available, the absence of intensity can feel wrong. Boredom may feel like emptiness. Stability may feel like threat. The nervous system seeks the familiar state, even if that state was formed in pain. Addictive behaviors can recreate internal environments that match early conditioning. They bring the body back to a known range of sensation. Not because that range is good, but because it is remembered. This is not a flaw in character. It is continuity in biology. The brain is conservative. It prefers what it knows. It resists erasing maps that once kept the organism functioning. Change requires the brain to tolerate periods of disorganization. Old patterns must weaken before new ones are strong. During this phase, the system feels exposed. There is no automatic path. Every decision costs energy. This is why early recovery feels unstable. The nervous system is learning a new baseline. It does not yet trust it. The strange comfort of familiar patterns is not sentimental. It is structural. It is encoded in circuits designed to keep organisms alive in unpredictable environments. Understanding this reframes the struggle. It shifts the narrative from self-control to state regulation, from weakness to adaptation. It also suggests that lasting change cannot rely on force. It must provide new forms of predictability, new ways for the body to settle, new rhythms that can become automatic. The brain does not abandon old patterns because they are wrong. It abandons them when something else proves more reliable, and reliability is not built through insight alone. It is built through repeated embodied experience, which means that to change an addictive loop, the nervous system must learn, again and again, that another response can lead to safety. That discomfort can be survived without returning to the old path, that unfamiliar states do not always end in harm. This learning is slow, it is incremental, it happens beneath language. Each time the body remains in an urge without acting, even briefly, a small piece of new data is recorded. The system notes that the state changed without the behavior. Each time an alternative action produces a tolerable outcome, another thread is woven. The old map does not vanish. It fades, and in its place a new familiarity begins to form, not all at once, not cleanly, but gradually, as the nervous system discovers that safety can exist without the old pattern. This is not a dramatic transformation. It is quiet. It often feels unimpressive from the inside. There is no clear moment where everything changes. There is only a slow rebalancing. And that rebalancing begins not with resistance, but with understanding how deeply the body has learned to associate familiarity with survival, which brings us closer to the machinery that teaches those associations in the first place, the reward systems that tag experiences as worth repeating and quietly shape the loops we live inside. Inside your brain there is a network whose job is not to make you happy, but to make you repeat what has helped you survive. It does this by marking experiences as important. Not morally important, biologically important. This network is often simplified as the reward system, but that name can be misleading. It is not a pleasure generator, it is a learning engine. At the center of this system is a chemical messenger called dopamine. Dopamine is commonly described as the feel-good molecule, but that description is inaccurate. Dopamine is not the sensation of pleasure itself, it is the signal that something is worth paying attention to and worth doing again. It is the brain's way of saying, "This matters. Remember this." When something unexpected improves your state, dopamine is released. The amount released is not tied to how pleasant the experience is, but to how surprising and informative it is. If an outcome is better than predicted, dopamine rises. If it is exactly as expected, dopamine stays neutral. If it is worse than expected, dopamine dips. This difference between expectation and outcome is called a prediction error. The brain is constantly generating predictions about what will happen next. Dopamine updates those predictions. If you taste a new food and it is better than anticipated, dopamine spikes. The brain adjusts its model. That food becomes valuable. If you repeat the experience and it matches the expectation, dopamine response shrinks. The event is now known. It no longer teaches. This is how learning becomes efficient. The brain stops wasting energy on what it already understands. Addictive substances and behaviors exploit this system. They create unusually large and consistent prediction errors. The chemical or sensory impact is far stronger than what the brain expects. Dopamine surges. The system flags the event as highly significant. This does not feel like a neutral update. It feels like urgency. It feels like focus. It feels like this matters more than other things. The brain does not interpret this as this is enjoyable. It interprets it as this is important for survival. That interpretation is not conscious. It is automatic. The circuitry involved includes the ventral tegmental area, which releases dopamine, the nucleus accumbens, which translates dopamine into motivation, and the prefrontal cortex, which integrates this information into planning and decision-making. Together they form a loop that links cue, action, and outcome. When dopamine rises, attention narrows. Competing stimuli lose salience. The brain orients toward the source of the signal. This is adaptive when the signal is food or safety. It becomes problematic when the signal comes from a drug, a device, or a behavior that artificially amplifies the response. With repetition, the system changes what triggers dopamine. Early on, the surge occurs during the effect. Later it shifts to the cue, the sight of the bottle, the sound of a notification, the time of day. The brain learns to anticipate. At that point, dopamine is no longer a response to pleasure. It becomes a driver of pursuit. The organism begins moving toward the behavior before any reward is received. The chemical signal is now attached to expectation. This is why craving feels active. It is not a passive wish. It is a state of readiness. Muscles tense, thoughts converge, the body prepares. Dopamine does not say enjoy, it says go. The system is designed this way because in natural environments, waiting to act until after pleasure would be inefficient. If a rustle in the bushes predicts prey, the organism must move before the meal exists. Dopamine motivates approach. Addictive stimuli hijack this mechanism. They create cues that reliably predict intense internal change. The brain treats those cues like survival signals. Over time, baseline dopamine function shifts. The brain reduces sensitivity, receptors down-regulate. The system becomes less responsive to ordinary experiences. This is not because the brain is broken. It is because it is adapting to constant overstimulation. When dopamine is repeatedly driven far above natural levels, the brain compensates by dampening the signal. What once felt significant becomes ordinary. What was once exciting becomes neutral. The organism requires stronger input to reach the same motivational state. This is tolerance at the neural level. The person does not simply want more because they are greedy. The system now requires more to produce the same signal. The baseline has moved. Meanwhile, everyday experiences that once produced modest dopamine responses now struggle to register. Food, conversation, movement, sunlight, rest. These generate signals within the normal biological range. Against the backdrop of artificially amplified input, they feel flat. The world loses contrast. This is why people in addiction often describe life as grey when they try to stop. It is not metaphorical, it is neurochemical. The reward system has recalibrated. Importantly, dopamine also interacts with stress systems. When access to the expected stimulus is blocked, stress hormones rise. The body enters a state of imbalance. The organism feels driven, restless, unsettled. This is not a moral reaction. It is a physiological one. The brain has learned that a particular action resolves this state. When the action is unavailable, the system signals urgency. This urgency is experienced as craving. Craving is not desire in the ordinary sense. It is a mismatch between predicted state and actual state. The brain expects relief. The body is prepared. When the relief does not arrive, tension accumulates. The person does not feel a neutral absence. They feel a problem. The prefrontal cortex, which supports long-term planning, is also affected by this cycle. Under repeated dopamine surges and stress activation, its regulatory capacity weakens. Decision-making becomes biased toward immediate resolution. This is not because rational thought disappears. It is because the system is being asked to override a strong biological signal with limited resources. When fatigue, hunger, isolation, or emotional strain are present, those resources are further depleted. At that point, the balance tips. The body chooses what it has learned to treat as essential. Understanding this reveals why addiction is persistent, even in people who understand the consequences. The knowledge exists, the biology is louder. This also explains why the early stages of change feel empty rather than relieved. Removing the stimulus does not immediately restore balance. The reward system remains down-regulated. Ordinary experiences do not yet produce sufficient signal. The organism is left in a motivational drought. During this period, the brain is recalibrating. Dopamine receptors slowly recover. Sensitivity returns. But this takes time measured in weeks and months, not in decisions. During that time, the person must live without the artificial signal while their system relearns how to respond to natural inputs. This is one of the most difficult phases. The absence is not only psychological, it is neurochemical. The nervous system is adapting. What helps during this phase is not simply restraint. It is the introduction of alternative sources of predictable, moderate dopamine. Movement, social contact, learning, structure, sunlight, novelty within safety. These do not replicate the old signal. They build a new baseline. Each time a small positive experience is repeated, the system updates. It begins to reassign importance. It learns that something else can move the needle. This is not immediate. The initial effect is often subtle. It does not feel like relief. It feels like neutrality. But the brain is recording. Over time, the contrast returns. The world regains texture. The reward system is not broken in addiction. It is overtrained. It has learned too clearly what produces the stronger signal. It has deprioritized everything else. Recovery is not about removing desire. It is about retraining what the brain tags as significant. This requires repeated exposure to alternative experiences while resisting the reflex to return to the most intense signal. The system will resist. Not emotionally, but biologically. That resistance is not a sign of failure. It is the expected response of a network doing what it evolved to do. The brain's reward machinery is not concerned with identity, values, or future goals. It is concerned with patterns that reduce uncertainty and improve immediate state. Understanding this does not remove the struggle, it explains it. It shows why effort alone is insufficient and why environment, routine, and bodily state matter. It also reveals why addiction is not simply about liking something too much. It is about a system that has learned to assign overwhelming importance to a narrow set of outcomes. The task of change is not to suppress that system, but to widen its field. And that widening begins with understanding that the brain is not seeking pleasure as much as it is seeking predictability. Which brings us to the next layer of the loop, the difference between wanting and having, and why the anticipation often becomes more powerful than the effect itself. One of the most confusing experiences in addiction is noticing that the anticipation feels stronger than the outcome. The moment before the action carries a charge, there is energy in it, focus, momentum. Then the behavior happens and the intensity drops. Sometimes it barely registers. The thing that was supposed to deliver relief feels flat, brief, or strangely empty. This is not a failure of expectation. It is the design of the system. The brain's reward machinery evolved to motivate pursuit, not consumption. In natural environments, survival depends on effort before reward. You search before you eat. You stalk before you catch. You build before you shelter. The chemical signals that drive behavior are therefore strongest during the phase of seeking. Dopamine rises in anticipation. It peaks during pursuit. Once the outcome is secured, the signal falls. From the brain's perspective, the work is done. This is why wanting often feels more vivid than having. The system is built to energize movement toward a goal, not to prolong satisfaction once the goal is reached. Pleasure itself is mediated by other neurotransmitters such as opioids and endocannabinoids. These produce the sensations of comfort or enjoyment. Dopamine does not produce those sensations. It produces drive. In addiction, this balance becomes exaggerated. Because addictive stimuli create unusually large dopamine responses, the seeking phase becomes intensely charged. The cue appears, the body shifts, attention narrows, the mind becomes preoccupied. There is a sense of urgency, a feeling that something is about to be resolved. This state can feel alive. Then the action occurs. The substance is taken. The app is opened. The behavior completes. Dopamine drops. The drive subsides. The body receives whatever sensory or chemical effect the behavior produces. But that effect rarely matches the intensity of the anticipation. The system has already moved on. This can be deeply confusing. The person may wonder why they keep returning to something that does not deliver what it promises. The promise feels real. The memory of wanting feels powerful. The memory of having feels faint. The brain does not store the experience symmetrically. Anticipation is tied to learning. It is encoded as a prediction. It carries emotional weight. The outcome, especially when it becomes routine, carries less informational value. It teaches little. It fades quickly. With repetition, the gap widens. The person begins chasing a state that no longer exists, not because they are foolish, but because the system has shifted the signal away from the outcome and onto the cue. At this point, the behavior is no longer about pleasure. It is about completing a pattern that has been energized by the brain. This is why many people report that their use feels compulsive rather than enjoyable. They may even feel disappointed during or after the behavior, but the anticipation continues to return with force. The system is not evaluating satisfaction. It is executing a learned sequence. This also explains why stopping feels like losing something important, even when the person knows intellectually that the behavior is harming them. What is lost is not the pleasure. What is lost is the charge, the sense of forward motion, the feeling that something is about to be resolved. Without the familiar anticipation, the mind can feel flat, directionless, understimulated. This is not a character flaw, it is a neurochemical shift. The reward system has been trained to produce energy around a narrow set of cues. When those cues are removed, the system does not immediately redirect, it remains quiet. During this phase, many people describe boredom that feels heavy, not simple restlessness, but a lack of engagement. Activities that once felt meaningful seem muted. The world feels distant. This state is often interpreted as evidence that life without the addiction is empty. In reality, it is evidence that the brain is recalibrating. The system must relearn what to anticipate. That relearning takes time. It requires repeated exposure to alternative sources of engagement. It requires the nervous system to experience moments of interest, effort, and completion that are not tied to the old pattern. Early on, these experiences feel weak. They do not produce the same charge. The person may conclude that they are ineffective. But the brain is not measuring intensity. It is measuring consistency. Each time a new activity produces even a small shift in state, the system updates. It begins to assign relevance. Over time, anticipation can grow around new cues. This is not dramatic. It does not feel like a rush. It feels like a gradual return of colour. Understanding the difference between wanting and having helps explain why reasoning alone cannot break addiction. The reflective mind may know that the outcome is unsatisfying, but the drive arises before reflection. It is generated by a system that does not evaluate outcomes in human terms. It also clarifies why people often relapse during moments of emotional charge rather than during calm deliberation. The wanting system activates under stress, fatigue, or emotional arousal. It does not wait for permission. The task of change is not to argue with that system. It is to give it something else to learn. This means that recovery cannot rely solely on removing the behavior. It must involve building new loops that include anticipation, effort, and completion. Structure matters. Routine matters. Predictable movement matters. The nervous system needs sequences it can run. Without them, the old sequence remains the most coherent option. This is why people often find that exercise, creative work, social rituals, or skill building become anchors in recovery. These activities provide a beginning, a middle, and an end. They allow anticipation to form. They create a sense of progress. They give the brain something to want. At first, the wanting is weak. It feels forced. But with repetition, the system adapts. The cues become meaningful. The anticipation grows. The old wanting does not disappear immediately. It fades through disuse. Each time the urge arises and is not followed by the familiar action, a small prediction error occurs. The brain expects relief. It does not arrive. Over time, the prediction weakens. This is not a single moment. It is a gradual update. The wanting system learns from experience, not from instruction. This is why patience is not just a virtue in recovery. It is a requirement. The biology moves at its own pace. The person is not waiting for desire to vanish. They are allowing the system to relearn what is worth anticipating. And this process is complicated by another layer of learning, the one that binds repetition into habit and gradually shifts control away from conscious choice, which is where the deeper mechanics of addiction continue to take shape. Repetition is one of the brain's most powerful teachers. It does not persuade, it does not explain, it simply reshapes. Each time an action is performed in a similar context, neural circuits involved in that action become slightly more efficient. The change is small, but it accumulates. Over time, what began as a deliberate choice becomes a default response. This is not metaphor, it is structural. Neurons that activate together begin to coordinate. Pathways that are used repeatedly become faster and require less metabolic energy. Competing pathways, used less often, become comparatively slow. The brain is not optimizing for virtue, it is optimizing for efficiency. The region most responsible for this transformation is the basal ganglia, a set of deep brain structures involved in action selection and habit formation. Early in learning, the prefrontal cortex is heavily involved. Decisions require attention. Each step is evaluated. The person is aware of choosing. With repetition, control shifts. The basal ganglia begin to execute the sequence with less input from reflective systems. The behavior becomes chunked. Instead of a series of steps, it becomes a single unit. This is why habits feel automatic. The brain is not asking whether the action aligns with goals. It is recognizing a pattern and running it. Addictive behaviors accelerate this process because they are repeated frequently and paired with strong internal signals. The learning is intense. The association between cue and action becomes deeply embedded. At this point, stopping is not a matter of resisting a desire. It's a matter of interrupting an automated program. The mind may hold a clear intention to change. That intention lives in cortical networks that support planning and self-monitoring. But the habit loop is stored in circuits designed to bypass deliberation. When a cue appears, the basal ganglia activate the sequence before conscious thought fully engages. The person may become aware only after the action has begun. This creates the experience of doing it without thinking. From the outside, this can look like carelessness. From the inside, it feels like a slip. The brain has learned that this sequence is reliable. It does not wait for permission. This is why people often describe feeling divided. One part knows better, another part moves anyway. There is no villain in this split. There are only systems with different functions and different speeds. The habit system exists to reduce cognitive load. It allows organisms to perform routine actions without exhausting attention. This is essential for survival. You do not consciously plan each step while walking. You do not evaluate every movement while tying your shoes. Addiction co-opts this machinery. What begins as a coping choice becomes a motor program. Once a behavior is habitual, effort is required not to perform it. The default is action. Inhibition becomes the active process. Inhibition is metabolically expensive. It depends on prefrontal resources. It is vulnerable to fatigue, stress, and emotional strain. This is why people often relapse at night, when tired, or during periods of upheaval. The inhibitory system weakens. The habit system continues. This is not weakness. It is physiology. Understanding this changes how change must be approached. If addiction was simply a matter of bad decisions, education and motivation would be sufficient. But habits are not undone by insight. They are undone by new learning. The old circuit must become less dominant. That happens through disuse. Each time the cue appears and the behavior does not follow, the prediction is violated. The brain notes the mismatch. Over time, the association weakens, but this weakening is gradual. The circuit does not disappear after one interruption. It fades through repetition of non-use. At the same time, alternative responses must be practiced. The brain cannot tolerate a vacuum. When a cue appears and the old sequence is blocked, something else must happen. If nothing replaces it, the system remains in a state of tension. The urge does not resolve. The brain continues to expect completion. This is why simply removing the behavior often fails. The loop is left open. Effective change involves building new loops. A cue is followed by a different action that leads to some form of resolution. It does not have to be pleasurable. It must be tolerable and repeatable. Over time, the brain begins to associate the cue with the new response. The old pathway weakens. The new one strengthens. This process is slow because it competes with a deeply ingrained program. Early on, the new response feels unnatural. It requires conscious effort. It does not produce the same internal shift. The person may conclude that it is ineffective, but the brain is not evaluating comfort. It is evaluating consistency. Each repetition matters. This is why change often feels harder than expected. The person is not simply resisting an urge. They are actively building a new neural pathway while suppressing an old one. This is metabolically demanding. It produces fatigue. It produces irritability. It produces a sense of effort that feels disproportionate. The brain is reorganizing. This reorganization is not visible. There is no clear feedback. The person does not feel the synapses shifting. They only feel the strain. Without understanding this, many interpret the difficulty as evidence of personal failure. They conclude that they lack discipline. They may abandon the effort. In reality, they are experiencing the cost of neural change. Habits form easily because the brain is designed to learn from repetition. They dissolve slowly for the same reason. The old circuit does not care that it is harmful. It cares that it is familiar. It will continue to activate until it no longer predicts success. That prediction changes only through experience. This means that lapses are not evidence that change is impossible. They are part of the learning process. Each time the person notices a lapse, the reflective system updates. Each time the person resumes the new pattern, the alternative circuit strengthens. Change is not linear, it is iterative. The habit system does not respond to promises, it responds to outcomes. Over time, if the new loop reliably resolves the cue, even imperfectly, the brain adjusts. The old program becomes less compelling. This does not mean the urge disappears, it means it loses dominance. The person begins to experience a gap between cue and action. The automaticity weakens. Choice becomes possible. This gap is the product of repeated interruption. It is built, not discovered. The brain is not broken in addiction. It is doing exactly what it evolved to do. It is optimizing for efficiency based on past experience. Understanding this reframes the struggle. It replaces blame with clarity. It reveals that what feels like weakness is actually the momentum of learning. The work is not to overpower that momentum, but to redirect it. And that redirection is deeply influenced by another factor that shapes habit loops from the beginning, the way stress and emotional relief become woven into behavior, which is where the next layer of the pattern continues to take form. Stress is not just an emotion, it is a full-body state. When something is perceived as threatening, uncertain, overwhelming, or uncontrollable, the nervous system shifts into a mode designed for survival. Heart rate changes, breathing becomes shallower, muscles tense, attention narrows, the body releases cortisol and adrenaline, energy is mobilized. This response evolved to help organisms escape predators, fight rivals, or endure danger. It is efficient in short bursts. It becomes harmful when it remains active for long periods. Modern stress rarely comes from immediate physical threats. It comes from social pressure, financial uncertainty, chronic fatigue, loneliness, unresolved conflict, and the constant demand to adapt. These conditions keep the system partially activated for hours or days at a time. The body does not distinguish between a charging animal and an overflowing inbox. It responds to both as forms of threat. Living in this state is exhausting. The nervous system seeks resolution. It seeks a way to return to baseline. It looks for anything that reliably changes internal state. This is where many addictive patterns begin. A behavior that reduces stress, even briefly, becomes valuable. The reduction does not have to be large. It only has to be noticeable. A drink that softens tension. A scroll that distracts from worry. A substance that quiets the body. A behavior that produces numbness or stimulation. The brain records the transition. Before, pressure, agitation, heaviness, unease. After, quieter, looser, lighter, less. The system learns that this action moves the needle. This learning does not occur in language. It occurs in physiology. The nervous system pairs the behavior with the shift in state. Over time, stress itself becomes a cue. The moment tension rises, the loop activates. The body predicts relief. The urge emerges. This is not a conscious strategy. It is an automatic response to internal conditions. Stress becomes both the trigger and the justification. This is why people often return to addictive behaviours during moments of emotional strain. Not because they have forgotten their intentions, but because the system is doing what it learned to do when pressure appears. The body is trying to regulate itself. In this sense, addiction is not only about pleasure, it is about escape. Escape from discomfort, escape from awareness, escape from feeling. This does not mean that the person wants to avoid life. It means that their nervous system has learned that certain states are intolerable without intervention. Some people grow up in environments where stress is constant. Conflict, unpredictability, neglect, or danger become the background. The body adapts. It learns to remain vigilant. Baseline arousal rises. In these conditions, the threshold for discomfort is lower. The system is already near its limit. Later in life, ordinary stresses feel overwhelming. The body reacts strongly. The person may feel confused by their own intensity. When a behavior reliably reduces that intensity, it becomes a tool. At first, it feels like self-care. The problem is not that the person seeks relief. The problem is that the relief comes from a source that trains the system to avoid rather than tolerate. Each time the behavior is used to escape, the nervous system learns that the state cannot be endured. It does not learn regulation, it learns interruption. The window of tolerance shrinks. The body becomes less capable of remaining present during discomfort. It expects immediate change. This creates a feedback loop. Stress triggers the behavior. The behavior prevents the system from learning that stress can pass. The next time stress appears, it feels more urgent. The behavior becomes more necessary. Over time, the person may find that even minor discomfort activates the urge. Boredom, fatigue, mild anxiety, emptiness. The system no longer differentiates. This is not fragility, it is conditioning. The nervous system has been taught that escape is the solution. This also explains why simply removing the behavior can feel unbearable. The person is not only losing a habit, they are losing their primary method of state regulation. Without it, stress feels raw, unfiltered, exposed. The body has not yet learned another way to settle. This is why early recovery often feels like being flayed. Not emotionally dramatic, but physiologically intense. The person is experiencing states that were previously interrupted. They are not regressing, they are feeling. And feeling without a learned regulatory strategy is frightening. This is where many attempts fail. The person may be told to sit with the feeling, but the body does not know how. There is no map. There is no memory of safety within discomfort. The nervous system interprets the state as dangerous. In this moment, the urge is not about pleasure, it is about survival. Returning to the behavior restores a familiar equilibrium. The body relaxes, the storm quiets, the system learns again. Breaking this cycle requires more than restraint. It requires teaching the nervous system that discomfort can be tolerated without catastrophe. This is not achieved through reasoning. It is achieved through experience. Small exposures, short durations, repeated. The person must remain in a stress state without escaping, long enough for the body to notice that nothing breaks. This is not easy. It must be done gradually. At the same time, alternative forms of regulation must be introduced. The system needs new tools, breathing patterns, movement, temperature changes, sensory grounding, social contact, rhythm, predictability. These are not psychological tricks, they are biological inputs. A slow exhale activates the vagus nerve. Movement discharges stress hormones. Warmth signals safety. Eye contact regulates arousal. Routine reduces uncertainty. These inputs teach the nervous system new associations. Stress no longer predicts only one solution. It predicts options. This is how resilience is built. Not through suppression, but through expansion. The system learns that tension can rise and fall without catastrophe. That feelings are states, not emergencies. That discomfort is not always a threat. This learning changes the meaning of stress. It becomes a signal rather than a command. But until this learning occurs, the person is not weak for seeking escape. They are responding to a body that believes escape is necessary. Understanding this removes moral judgment. It reveals addiction as an adaptation to unregulated stress. The behavior is not the problem. It is the solution the body found. To replace it, the nervous system must be given other ways to find relief, and that process depends not only on present stress, but on how memory and emotion bind past relief to future expectation, shaping the pull long after the original need has passed, which is where the next layer of the pattern continues to deepen. Memory in the brain is not a passive record. It is an active system that links experiences with internal states. When something changes how you feel, the nervous system does not only register what happened, it registers what it meant for your body. This kind of memory is not stored as a narrative. It is stored as association. The hippocampus tracks context. The amygdala tracks emotional weight. The reward system tracks value. Together they bind situations to internal shifts. A place becomes linked with calm. A smell becomes linked with comfort. A behavior becomes linked with relief. These links form quickly when the emotional contrast is strong. If a person moves from stress to ease, from agitation to quiet, from numbness to stimulation, the brain marks the event as significant. It does not encode the story of the moment, it encodes the pattern before and after. Later, when part of that pattern appears again, the system activates. This is why a certain time of day can carry a pull, why a room can feel charged, why a feeling alone can trigger an urge. The memory is not recalled, it is reactivated. Emotion plays a central role in this process. Emotional states modulate learning. The brain prioritizes information that appears during heightened arousal. This is adaptive. In uncertain environments, what happens during strong emotion often matters. Addictive experiences tend to occur in emotionally loaded contexts. Loneliness, relief, celebration, exhaustion, escape. The emotional charge strengthens the memory. Over time, the emotional tone becomes fused with the behavior. The person may no longer remember the first time the pattern formed. They may not remember what problem it solved, but the body remembers the shift. This is why urges often feel disconnected from present reality. The person may be content, yet a pull appears. The mind searches for a reason. There is none. The system is responding to a cue that carries historical weight. This weight is not logical. It is embodied. The memory does not say, "This helped me once." It says, "This changes my state." That is enough. This also explains why people can feel drawn back to behaviors long after the original circumstances have changed. The body is responding to a map that no longer matches the terrain. The nervous system does not update automatically. It updates through experience. If the person repeatedly encounters the cue without receiving the old outcome, the association weakens. But until then, the echo remains. This echo is not nostalgia. It is prediction. The brain is forecasting a change. When the forecast fails, disappointment follows, not in thought, but in chemistry. Dopamine drops, stress rises. This is often interpreted as loss. The person may say, "I miss it," even when the behavior caused harm. What they miss is not the effect. It is the internal shift they learn to expect. Memory is doing its job. In healthy systems, emotional memory helps guide behavior toward what supports survival. It is why warmth feels inviting, why safety feels calming, why hunger drives search. In addiction, this system becomes biased. The brain overrepresents a narrow set of experiences. It assigns them disproportionate emotional weight. Other experiences fade. This bias is not deliberate. It emerges from repetition. Each time the behavior produces a shift, the memory strengthens. Each time it is used to regulate emotion, the association deepens. Eventually the emotional landscape narrows. The system learns that relief comes from one direction. This makes alternative experiences feel muted. They are not linked to strong emotional change. They do not compete. The person may intellectually value relationships, creativity, health, but the emotional memory system does not yet connect those with internal relief. It has learned one language. This is why recovery requires more than removing the behavior. It requires building new emotional associations. The person must experience relief, calm, interest or connection in other contexts. The nervous system must register new transitions. This is slow because emotional memory is conservative. It resists change. One positive experience is not enough. The system needs repetition. Each time a new activity produces even a modest shift, the association strengthens. Over time, the emotional map expands. The old echo does not vanish immediately. It overlaps with new ones. This is why urges can appear unexpectedly, even after long periods of change. The memory exists. It may be dormant, but it can be reactivated. This is not failure. It is residual learning. The brain does not erase maps. It layers them. What changes is dominance. The old association loses its monopoly. It becomes one option among many. This is the goal. Understanding the role of emotional memory removes mystery from craving. It shows that the pull is not about present desire. It is about past learning. The system is responding to an internal archive. That archive was written during moments of relief. The body remembers what it felt like to move from strain to ease. It does not care why. This does not mean that the person is trapped. It means that the work of change is experiential. The nervous system must be given new data. It must learn that other transitions are possible. This is why supportive environments matter, why routine matters, why safety matters. When a person feels chronically threatened, the system does not update. It clings to old maps. When a person experiences repeated safety without the old behavior, the system adapts. The echo fades, not through willpower, through exposure. Each time the body remains in discomfort and nothing breaks, a new memory forms. Each time a person feels calm without the behavior, a new association is written. Each time connection occurs without the old pattern, the emotional landscape changes. This is not dramatic. It is incremental, but it is real. The brain is not haunted. It is trained, and what has been trained can be retrained. The echo of past pleasure persists because it once solved a problem. It fades when the system learns that the problem no longer requires that solution. This learning does not happen in thought. It happens in the body. Which brings us to another reason addiction feels so powerful, the way the body itself begins to anticipate and prepare before the mind is even aware, carrying the loop forward through sensation rather than intention. The experience people describe as losing control rarely feels like a dramatic moment. It is usually quiet, subtle. The body shifts first. Attention narrows. The familiar sequence begins unfolding before there is a clear sense of having decided. From the outside, this can look like a choice. From the inside, it often feels like momentum. This is not because the person has no agency. It is because control in the brain is not centralized. Different systems govern different kinds of action, and they do not operate at the same speed. Deliberate control lives primarily in the prefrontal cortex. This region supports planning, reflection, inhibition, and long-term reasoning. It is the part of the brain that can say, "This will hurt me later," and adjust behavior accordingly. Automatic control lives in subcortical systems such as the basal ganglia and brainstem. These systems manage habits, reflexes, and state-dependent responses. They operate quickly. They require little conscious input. They evolved to keep organisms alive in situations where waiting to think would be dangerous. In addiction, these two systems fall out of balance. The habit system becomes highly trained. The reflective system becomes overworked. When a cue appears, the automatic pathway activates first. It does not wait for deliberation. It does not ask permission. It begins preparing the body. By the time awareness arrives, the sequence is already underway. This creates the feeling that control is slipping through the fingers. The person may notice themselves moving toward the behavior, while simultaneously thinking that they do not want to. This is not hypocrisy. It is parallel processing. Two systems are active at once. One is executing a learned program. The other is evaluating consequences. They are not synchronized. Stress, fatigue, and emotional load widen this gap. The prefrontal cortex is metabolically expensive. It requires glucose, oxygen, and relative calm. Under strain, its capacity diminishes. It becomes less effective at inhibition. The habit system does not require these conditions. It remains active under threat. This is why people often relapse during moments of exhaustion or emotional overwhelm. The system that could intervene is offline. The person may later say, "I don't know what I was thinking." Often they were not thinking, not in the way people imagine thinking. The behavior was not preceded by a full internal debate. It emerged from a pattern. This does not mean that the person is powerless. It means that power is state-dependent. Control is not a trait. It is a function. It fluctuates with sleep, nutrition, stress, emotional safety, and cognitive load. When those supports are weak, the automatic system dominates. Understanding this changes how self-control must be approached. It cannot be treated as a constant resource. It must be conserved. This is why environments matter so much in recovery. Removing cues reduces the need for inhibition. Structuring routines reduces decision fatigue. Simplifying choices preserves prefrontal capacity. This is not avoidance. It is strategy. Expecting the reflective mind to override a deeply ingrained habit under conditions of stress is unrealistic. It is like asking a tired muscle to lift a heavy weight repeatedly. Eventually it fails. This failure is not moral. It is mechanical. Change becomes possible when the person stops trying to win every moment through force and instead reduces the number of moments that require force. This is why people in recovery often redesign their lives. They change schedules, they alter routes, they avoid certain places, they build structure. These changes are not signs of fragility, they are acknowledgements of biology. The automatic system responds to cues. Remove the cue, and the program does not run. Over time, as new habits form, the load on the prefrontal cortex decreases. The new patterns become automatic. Control feels less effortful, but in the early stages, control feels slippery because it is. The person is relying on a system that is depleted and competing with one that is efficient. Every time the person interrupts the habit, they strengthen the reflective pathway. Every time they prepare for a vulnerable moment, they conserve resources. This is not dramatic, it is procedural. Control is not restored through intensity, it is restored through reliability. The brain learns that alternative responses are available. It learns that the reflective system can be trusted. It learns that the automatic program is no longer the only option. This learning takes time. During that time, the person may feel inconsistent. They may succeed one day and fail the next. They may feel confused by their own variability. This variability is not evidence of insincerity. It is evidence of transition. Two systems are competing. The goal is not to eliminate the automatic system. It is to retrain it. As new patterns are repeated, they become chunked. They move out of deliberation and into habit. Eventually, the new behavior runs on its own. At that point, control no longer feels slippery. It feels ordinary. The person does not need to resist. They simply act. This is what sustainable change looks like. Not constant effort, not constant vigilance, but the gradual transfer of new responses into the same machinery that once carried the old ones. The mind does not regain control by fighting the body. It regains control by teaching the body new defaults. And that teaching begins with recognizing that the body itself is not neutral in this process. It learns faster than thought. It anticipates. It prepares. It carries the loop forward before the mind arrives, which is why the next layer of this pattern lives not in intention, but in sensation. Long before a thought forms, the body is already adjusting. Muscles shift, breathing changes, hormones begin to move, the nervous system prepares. This happens in fractions of a second, without language, without awareness. It is how organisms survive. You pull your hand from heat before you think. You flinch before you decide. The body is built to act first and explain later. Addiction takes hold inside this same machinery. When a pattern is repeated often enough, the body begins to anticipate it. Not intellectually, but physiologically. The heart rate may change when a familiar cue appears. The stomach may tighten, saliva may increase. A subtle restlessness may spread through the limbs. These are not emotions in the usual sense, they are preparatory states. The body is getting ready. By the time the mind notices an urge, the body has already moved partway into the sequence. The person may feel as if the desire appeared out of nowhere. In reality, a cascade has already begun. This is why people often say, "I don't even realize I'm doing it until I'm halfway through." They are not exaggerating. The brainstem and limbic systems operate beneath awareness. They regulate arousal, orientation, and action readiness. These systems respond directly to cues and internal states. They do not wait for interpretation. They do not require meaning. They operate on pattern. If a certain time of day has repeatedly preceded a behavior, the body begins preparing at that time. If a certain emotion has been paired with relief, the body prepares when that emotion appears. If a certain place has been associated with a habit, the body shifts when entering that space. This preparation feels like an urge, but it is more fundamental than desire. It is readiness. The mind experiences it as a pull. The body experiences it as imbalance. The person may try to reason with it. They may remind themselves of consequences. They may attempt to delay. But the body is already in motion. This mismatch between bodily state and cognitive intention creates distress. The person may feel out of alignment with themselves. They may describe feeling possessed, hijacked, or out of control. What is actually happening is that a faster system is running. The body has learned the loop more thoroughly than the mind. Learning in the body does not require understanding. It requires repetition. Each time the behavior resolves a state, the body records the transition. It does not store it as a story. It stores it as a shift in baseline. Over time, the body begins to treat the behavior as part of its regulatory equipment. Just as it uses breathing to adjust oxygen levels, it uses the habit to adjust emotional state. This is why simply telling yourself "don't" is often ineffective. The instruction lives in a different system than the impulse. The body does not speak in words, it speaks in sensation. To change a bodily pattern, the body must be taught. This teaching occurs through experience, not through argument. When a person interrupts a habit, the body enters a state it does not recognize. The expected resolution does not occur. Tension remains. The system becomes alert. If this state persists and nothing harmful happens, the body begins to update. It learns that the absence of the behavior is survivable. This learning is subtle. It does not feel like progress. It feels like discomfort, but it is information. Each time the body experiences an urge without acting and remains intact, a new association is formed. The system begins to register that this state does not require the old solution. This is the core of retraining. It is not heroic. It is repetitive. It often looks like sitting with restlessness for a few minutes, letting anxiety rise and fall, allowing boredom to exist, feeling the urge peak and subside. These experiences are teaching moments for the nervous system. They are not tests of character, they are exposures. The body learns in gradients. It does not leap. It inches. If the person attempts to endure too much at once, the system becomes overwhelmed. The old pattern reasserts itself. The brain learns that discomfort is dangerous. This reinforces the loop. Effective change respects the pace of the body. Short interruptions, small delays, partial substitutions, each one creates a data point. The body is conservative. It does not abandon a strategy until it has evidence. The evidence it needs is not intellectual. It is physiological. It must experience that a different response can regulate state. This is why alternative actions in recovery are often simple and physical. Walking, drinking water, stretching, breathing, touching something textured, changing temperature, speaking aloud. These are not distractions, they are regulatory inputs. They speak the body's language. When an urge arises and the person takes a slow breath, the vagus nerve is stimulated. Heart rate shifts. The body receives a signal of safety. The internal state changes. The brain records the transition. When the person moves, stress hormones are metabolized. Tension discharges. The body settles. The brain records the transition. Over time, these small shifts become associated with the cue. The body learns that another path exists. This does not erase the old path. It adds another. The goal is not to silence the body. It is to educate it. This education is not conscious. It is experiential. This is why people often report that change feels different than they expected. They imagined a moment of clarity. What they encounter instead is repetition. They imagined motivation. They encounter training. They imagined a mental battle. They encounter a bodily process. The body learns before the mind because the body is older. It evolved before language. It learned survival before reflection. Addiction lives in that older system. Recovery must reach it. This is why kindness matters. Harshness activates threat. Threat strengthens automatic responses. The body closes. Gentleness allows learning, not softness in the sense of avoidance, but patience in the sense of pace. The body does not respond to condemnation. It responds to consistency. Each time the person treats an urge as information rather than as failure, the nervous system remains engaged rather than defensive. Each time the person allows a state to pass without panic, the system updates. This is slow work. It is not visible. It does not feel like success. But it is the only kind that lasts, because the body is not convinced by intention. It is convinced by experience. And until the body learns that another way exists, control will continue to feel slippery, urges will continue to arise, and the loop will continue to assert itself. The mind may understand the pattern. The body must live a different one. And that difference becomes harder as tolerance and baseline shift over time, quietly changing what feels normal, which is how the next layer of addiction takes shape. Craving is often described as a feeling, but in biological terms it is closer to a state. It is not a single thought or desire. It is a coordinated shift across multiple systems. Hormones change, muscles tighten, attention narrows, the body moves into readiness. What you experience as "I want this" is the conscious surface of a deeper physiological process. Seen this way, craving behaves less like a decision and more like weather. It forms under specific conditions. It builds in response to pressure. It follows patterns. It rises, peaks, and falls. It cannot be argued away, and it does not respond to logic in the moment. It passes when the internal conditions change. This is not a metaphor meant to soften its impact. It is a practical description of how the nervous system operates. Craving emerges when three elements converge: a cue associated with past relief, a body state that signals imbalance or need, a reward system trained to predict resolution. When these align, the system shifts. The hypothalamus adjusts hormone output. The amygdala heightens vigilance. Dopamine systems activate anticipation. The autonomic nervous system moves toward arousal. The body prepares for action. From the inside, this feels like pressure, restlessness, a narrowing of focus. Thoughts begin circling the object of the habit. Other concerns fade. This is not imagination. It is allocation of resources. The brain is prioritizing what it has learned to treat as important. Craving does not appear randomly. It follows patterns, time of day, emotional state, physical condition, social context, environment. Over time, these conditions become predictive. A person may notice that urges rise in the evening, after conflict, when tired, when alone, or when entering certain places. These are not coincidences. They are learned correlations. The body has linked these states with resolution. When the state appears, the system activates. This activation is not gentle. It is urgent. The body does not whisper. It mobilizes. This is why craving feels compelling. It is not simply an idea. It is a full-body event. Attempts to suppress it through reasoning often fail because reasoning operates in a different system. The prefrontal cortex can generate arguments. The craving state is driven by subcortical networks that evolve to override reflection when survival is at stake. The body does not negotiate. This does not mean craving is unstoppable. It means it must be approached differently. If craving is treated as a command, the person feels compelled. If it is treated as a moral failure, shame is added, increasing stress and strengthening the state. If it is treated as a biological event, something that rises and falls, the person can relate to it differently. Craving has a trajectory. It builds, it peaks, it declines. Most people do not experience this decline because the behavior interrupts it. The loop is closed before the body learns what happens if it is left open. The nervous system never discovers that the state is temporary. This is critical. The body assumes that the only way out is through the habit because it has never experienced another resolution. Craving is not endless. It feels endless when it has never been allowed to complete its natural arc. When a person resists an urge, the body enters unfamiliar territory. The expected outcome does not occur. Stress may rise. Sensations intensify. This is often interpreted as proof that resistance is harmful. In reality, it is the beginning of learning. If the person remains in the state without acting, the system eventually exhausts itself. Stress hormones are metabolized, arousal peaks and declines, the body settles. This settling is the key data point. The nervous system learns that the state can resolve without the old behavior. This learning does not occur in one exposure. It requires repetition. Each time a craving rises and falls without completion of the habit, the prediction weakens. The next time, the intensity may be slightly lower, the rise slightly slower, the peak slightly shorter. This change is not dramatic. It is incremental. The body is updating its model. Craving behaves like weather because it is governed by internal conditions. Hunger, fatigue, stress, loneliness, overstimulation, understimulation. These conditions alter neurotransmitter balance and autonomic tone. They change the internal climate. In a depleted system, cravings form more easily. This is why self-care is not a luxury in recovery. It is infrastructure. Sleep stabilizes prefrontal function. Nutrition regulates glucose and hormones. Movement metabolizes stress chemicals. Social contact reduces threat signaling. Structure reduces uncertainty. These factors change the baseline. A nervous system that is rested, fed, and safe produces fewer storms. This does not eliminate craving. It changes its frequency and intensity. Understanding craving as a state rather than a moral event changes how it is handled. Instead of asking, "Why do I want this?" the person can ask, "What is my body doing right now?" Instead of saying, "I shouldn't feel this," they can say, "This is a wave." The goal is not to suppress the wave, it is to ride it. Riding does not mean enduring endlessly, it means allowing the body to experience the arc. This is uncomfortable, it requires tolerance. Tolerance is not a trait, it is a capacity that grows with use. The first time a person allows a craving to pass, it may feel overwhelming. The body has no reference. The second time, it is slightly more familiar. The system begins to learn. This learning is not linear. Some urges will be stronger, some weaker. Stress will amplify them, safety will reduce them. Over time, the pattern changes. The person begins to recognize the early signs: a shift in posture, a tightening in the chest, a narrowing of thought. This awareness creates space. In that space, alternative actions can occur. The body still activates, but it is not alone. This is the beginning of regulation. Craving is not an enemy. It is a signal that the system has entered a familiar state. It is the body saying, "I know a way out." Recovery is teaching the body that there are others. This teaching happens through lived experience. Each time a craving is met with a different response, the body updates. Each time the wave passes, the prediction weakens. Each time the system settles without the habit, resilience grows. This does not mean that craving disappears. It becomes less commanding. It becomes weather rather than law. The person can say, "This is happening in me," rather than "I must act." That shift is not philosophical. It is neurological. It reflects the gradual recalibration of systems that once treated the habit as essential. Understanding craving as a biological weather pattern removes the sense of personal defect. It reveals a process that can be observed, anticipated, and navigated. It also highlights why long-term change depends on stabilizing the internal climate. A nervous system constantly under strain will produce storms. A system supported by rhythm, safety, and care becomes more predictable. This predictability does not eliminate challenge. It reduces volatility. The body becomes less reactive. Craving becomes an event rather than an identity. And as the baseline shifts, another process quietly unfolds. The way repeated exposure to the same behavior changes what feels normal, altering the internal reference point in ways that are easy to miss but difficult to reverse, which is where the next layer of the pattern takes hold. Tolerance is not a sudden change. It does not arrive with an announcement. It develops quietly through repetition, by small adjustments in the nervous system that are almost impossible to feel in the moment. Each time a behavior or substance produces a strong internal shift, the brain adapts. It dampens its response. It adjusts its baseline. What once stood out begins to blend in. This is not malfunction. It is regulation. The brain is built to maintain stability. When it is repeatedly pushed in one direction, it compensates. Receptors become less sensitive. Neurotransmitter release changes. Circuits recalibrate. The goal is balance. With addictive behaviors, this balancing act moves the internal reference point. Early on, the behavior produces a noticeable change. Relief is clear. Stimulation is vivid. The contrast between before and after is strong. That contrast is what teaches the system. Over time, the same input produces a smaller effect. The shift is less dramatic. The system has adapted. From the outside, this looks like escalation. More of the substance, more time in the behavior, more intensity. From the inside, it feels like returning to neutral. The person is no longer chasing pleasure. They are trying to feel normal. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of addiction. It is often framed as excess desire. In reality, it is often a response to deprivation. The baseline has moved. What once felt like ordinary life now feels flat. Energy is lower. Motivation is muted. Mood is dull. The nervous system has adjusted to a higher level of stimulation or relief. Without the behavior, the person does not feel neutral. They feel below baseline. This state is not imagined. It reflects real changes in receptor density, neurotransmitter dynamics, and circuit sensitivity. The body is not being dramatic. It is recalibrated. This is why early abstinence feels like a deficit. The person may say, "I don't feel like myself." What they mean is that the internal environment has changed. The brain needs time to readjust. Tolerance develops because the nervous system treats repeated stimulation as the new normal. It assumes that what happens often will continue. It prepares. In evolutionary terms, this is efficient. If food is abundant, the system adjusts metabolism. If danger is constant, arousal increases. If stimulation is frequent, sensitivity decreases. The system is always trying to predict and stabilize. In addiction, this predictive process becomes maladaptive. The brain begins to expect an input that is not naturally available. It reorganizes around that expectation. When the input is removed, the system does not immediately revert. It continues to operate as if the input should be there. This creates a gap. The person experiences fatigue, irritability, restlessness, low mood, or emptiness. These are not moral reactions. They are signs of a nervous system operating under a shifted baseline. The body is asking for what it has learned to expect. This is often interpreted as evidence that the person needs the behavior. In reality, the system needs time. Tolerance is reversible but not instantly. Receptors upregulate slowly. Neurochemical balance returns gradually. Circuits recalibrate through disuse. This process unfolds over weeks and months. During this period, the person lives in a state that feels unfamiliar. Ordinary experiences may not register. Activities that once brought interest feel muted. The world seems distant. This can be deeply discouraging. Many people conclude that life without the behavior is inherently empty. They assume that something essential has been removed. What has actually been removed is an artificial reference point. The brain is learning how to respond again. This learning is not conscious. It is biochemical. The person cannot think their way out of it. They must live through it. Each day without the behavior provides data. The system notes that survival continues, that experiences still occur, that internal states still shift. Slowly, sensitivity returns. This is why time is a central factor in recovery. Not because time heals emotionally, but because the nervous system requires duration to recalibrate. Tolerance also affects perception of stress. When the baseline is shifted, ordinary discomfort feels more intense. The person has less buffer. Minor stressors feel overwhelming. This is not fragility. It is reduced margin. The system has less flexibility. This makes early recovery feel volatile. Small problems feel large. Emotional swings are sharper. The body is operating without its usual dampener. This volatility often leads people back to the behavior, not because they want pleasure, but because they want stability. The old pattern offers a familiar correction. Understanding this reframes relapse. It is not a return to indulgence, it is a response to imbalance. This does not excuse harm, it explains pressure. Supporting the system during this phase is critical. Predictable routines, adequate rest, nutrition, gentle movement, low stimulation environments, social safety. These inputs help stabilize baseline. They do not replace the old effect. They create a new one. The nervous system begins to learn that equilibrium can be achieved without the habit. This learning is slow because the system is conservative. It does not trust easily. It has learned that one input reliably produces balance. It must experience many days without that input while remaining intact. Only then does it adjust its expectations. Tolerance is the quiet architect of dependence. It changes what feels normal without drawing attention. The person does not notice the shift as it happens. They only notice the absence later. This is why people often say, "I don't even know when it got this bad." It did not happen in a moment. It happened in increments. Each repetition nudged the baseline. Each adjustment felt small. Over time, the system reorganized. Reversing this is also incremental. There is no moment when the brain announces that it has healed. There are only small signs. A laugh feels warmer. A walk feels grounding. Food tastes more vivid. Sleep deepens. Curiosity returns. These changes are subtle. They accumulate. The internal reference point moves again. the person begins to recognize a different version of normal. Not the old one, not the addicted one, a new one. This new normal does not feel like a high. It feels like range. There is room to move. There is tolerance for discomfort. There is space between urge and action. This is not perfection. It is flexibility. And flexibility is what addiction quietly erodes. Tolerance narrows the field of experience. It trains the system to respond to fewer signals. Recovery widens it again, not by force, by time, by exposure, by letting the nervous system remember what else exists. This widening does not end the work. It creates the conditions for it. Because once the baseline shifts, the question becomes not only how to stop, but why stopping feels so hard when others say it should be simple, which leads directly into the next layer of the struggle, the way language like just stop misunderstands the biology that has been quietly reshaped. From the outside, addiction often looks like a simple problem with a simple solution. There is a behaviour that causes harm. The person is aware of that harm. The logical response seems obvious. Stop doing the thing. This framing assumes that behaviour is governed primarily by conscious choice. It assumes that once a person understands the consequences, they will adjust accordingly. It treats action as the output of reasoning. But by the time a pattern qualifies as addiction, it is no longer governed primarily by reasoning. It is governed by systems that operate beneath awareness, shaped by repetition, stress, emotional learning, and neurochemical adaptation. The behaviour is no longer just something the person does, it is something the nervous system expects. Just stop, asks the reflective mind to override a set of deeply trained biological processes using intention alone. This is like asking a person to slow their heart rate through willpower. It can be influenced indirectly. It cannot be commanded directly. When someone attempts to stop purely through decision, several forces immediately converge. The habit system activates in response to cues. The reward system predicts resolution. The stress system reacts to the absence of the expected outcome. The body enters a state of imbalance. The person feels driven, unsettled, and preoccupied. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex is asked to inhibit a response that has become automatic. This inhibition is metabolically costly. It depends on resources that are often already depleted in people struggling with addiction. Fatigue, sleep disruption, emotional strain, and stress reduce inhibitory capacity. So the person is asked to perform their most difficult task at the moment, when their ability to perform it is weakest. This is not a fair contest. When they fail, the failure is interpreted as weakness. The person may internalize this judgment. They may conclude that they lack discipline or character. This interpretation increases shame. Shame increases stress. Stress activates the very systems that drive the habit. The loop tightens. Just stop does not account for any of this. It treats addiction as a preference rather than a state. It ignores the way the brain has been reshaped. It assumes that desire and action are the same thing. They are not. Desire arises in one system. Action is executed by another. Inhibition depends on a third. These systems do not respond equally to instruction. This is why people can sincerely want to stop and still find themselves repeating the behaviour. The wanting exists. The capacity to execute that want is constrained by biology. Change becomes possible when the task is reframed. Instead of asking the person to overpower the urge, the goal becomes to change the conditions that generate it and the systems that maintain it. This involves reducing exposure to cues, stabilizing stress and sleep, building predictable routines, introducing alternative regulatory actions, gradually expanding tolerance for discomfort, allowing the nervous system time to recalibrate. None of these are dramatic. They are structural. They reduce the load on the prefrontal cortex. They prevent automatic activation. They give the body new data. Over time, the behavior becomes less automatic, the urge becomes less urgent, the system becomes more flexible. At that point, stopping becomes easier, not because the person has become stronger, but because the task has become smaller. This is why environments matter, why early recovery often involves removing access. Why support systems are externalized. These are not crutches, they are scaffolding. They allow the brain to learn without being overwhelmed. Just stop assumes that the person has full control in every moment. Biology does not work that way. Control is conditional. It varies with state. Effective change respects this. It does not demand perfection. It creates conditions where imperfection does not undo progress. Each lapse is treated as information, not as proof of failure. The system learns. Over time, the gap between urge and action widens. The person experiences moments where they notice the impulse and do not immediately move. This gap is the real victory. It is the product of neural change. Just stop bypasses this process. It demands an outcome without allowing the mechanism to shift. It treats addiction as a choice rather than as a learned state. This misunderstanding harms not only individuals but systems of care. It leads to approaches that emphasize punishment over support, willpower over structure, blame over training. It produces cycles of effort and collapse. Understanding why just stop fails opens space for a different question. Not, why can't I stop? But, what would my nervous system need in order to stop? That question changes everything. It leads away from self-attack and toward design. It invites the person to build a life that does not constantly trigger the loop. It recognizes that the brain must be taught, not scolded. This teaching is not quick. It is cumulative. It happens in small choices repeated. It happens in how the person sleeps, eats, moves, connects, and rests. It happens in how they respond to discomfort. It happens in how they interpret lapses. Each of these moments is a lesson for the nervous system. The system is always learning. The question is what it is being taught. Just stop teaches that failure is proof of defect. A biological approach teaches that difficulty is proof of learning in progress. One collapses the person into shame. The other gives them a path. And that path does not lead through force, but through reconfiguration, through changing not just what is avoided, but what is built in its place. Which brings us to the next step in this process, how loops are actually broken, and what real change requires at the level of body, brain, and daily life. Breaking an addictive loop is often imagined as an act of removal. The behavior is identified. It is cut out. What remains is assumed to be freedom. In practice, what remains is a system that has been organized around that behavior. The loop is not just the action. It is the relationship between cue, state, and resolution. Remove the action without changing the other elements, and the loop remains open. The body still enters the state. The cue still triggers the pattern. The nervous system still expects completion. This is why stopping alone rarely holds. What actually breaks a loop is not absence. It is replacement. Not replacement in the sense of finding something equally intense, but in the sense of giving the system another way to move from one state to another. A loop consists of three components: a trigger, internal or external, a state of imbalance or activation, a response that changes that state. Addiction trains a very specific version of the sequence. Breaking the loop requires altering at least one of these components, and ideally all three. The trigger can be reduced, the state can be buffered, the response can be changed. This is not a single act. It is a process. Reducing triggers does not mean avoiding life. It means identifying patterns, times, places, emotions, and conditions that reliably activate the loop. This awareness allows the person to make adjustments. They may change routines. They may avoid certain environments. They may prepare for vulnerable moments. These changes reduce how often the automatic program is initiated. This is not weakness, it is system design. Buffering the state means stabilizing the nervous system so that triggers produce less activation. Sleep, nutrition, hydration, movement, rhythm, and social safety all influence baseline arousal. A system that is rested and supported does not spike as easily. Stress narrows capacity. Safety widens it. This is why recovery often begins with what looks like ordinary life maintenance. Regular meals, consistent sleep, predictable schedules. These are not peripheral, they are central. They lower the internal pressure that drives the loop. Changing the response is the most visible part of the work. When a trigger appears and the state shifts, something different must happen. This alternative response must meet certain conditions. It must be immediate, accessible, repeatable, capable of shifting state, even slightly. It does not need to be dramatic. It does not need to be inspiring. It needs to work at the level of the body. A slow breath, a glass of water, standing up, stepping outside, stretching, sending a message, walking for 5 minutes. These actions speak to the nervous system. They interrupt the sequence. They create a new transition. The first time, this feels artificial. The body does not yet trust it. The state may not shift much. The urge may remain, but the brain records the attempt. Each repetition strengthens the alternative path. Over time, the new response becomes more effective. The body begins to associate the trigger with this action. The loop is rewritten. This does not happen through insight. It happens through rehearsal. The nervous system does not generalize well. It learns in context. If a person always reaches for a substance when tired in the evening, they must practice a different response in that specific state, not in theory, in reality. If a person scrolls when anxious, they must experience anxiety and respond differently. This is uncomfortable. It is also the only way the system updates. Avoidance alone does not teach. It prevents activation. It is useful early. It is not sufficient long-term. The body must learn that when this state arises, another path exists. This learning is slow because the old path is efficient. The new path is awkward. It requires attention. At first, it feels like effort. With repetition, it becomes easier. With enough repetition, it becomes automatic. This is when change stabilizes. The person no longer has to think about what to do. The alternative response runs on its own. The loop is broken not by erasing it, but by out-competing it. The brain prefers the path that resolves the state with the least cost. At first, the old path wins. With time, the balance shifts. This process is not linear. Stress will amplify the old loop. Fatigue will weaken inhibition. Unexpected events will overwhelm capacity. There will be lapses. Lapses are not resets. They are part of learning. Each time a person returns to the new pattern after a lapse, the system updates. The reflective system strengthens. The alternative loop gains ground. Shame interrupts this process. It signals threat. It narrows capacity. It drives the system back toward automatic responses. Compassion supports it. It keeps the nervous system engaged. This does not mean excusing harm. It means responding to difficulty as information rather than as defect. The person is not failing to change. They are in the middle of change. Breaking loops requires time because it requires biological reorganization. It requires reducing activation, rehearsing alternatives, allowing discomfort, repeating new responses, stabilizing baseline, letting the nervous system learn. This is not dramatic. It is procedural. It looks like small decisions made many times. It looks like tolerating a feeling for 30 seconds. It looks like choosing a walk over a reflex. It looks like noticing a pattern and adjusting a schedule. It looks like building a life that does not constantly provoke the old loop. Change does not come from a single moment of resolve. It comes from redesigning the environment in which resolve is required. Each adjustment reduces the load on control. Each routine reduces uncertainty. Each new habit becomes another automatic process. Eventually, the person does not feel like they are breaking a loop. They feel like they are living differently. The old pattern still exists. It may surface under extreme stress, but it is no longer dominant. The nervous system has learned alternatives. This learning is the core of recovery. It is not about becoming a different person. It is about teaching the same nervous system new sequences, and once those sequences exist, another shift becomes possible, one that moves beyond managing urges and into rebuilding a sense of safety that does not depend on escape, which is where the next stage of this process begins. Recovery is often described as abstinence. In practice, it is a process of teaching the nervous system that safety can exist without escape. Addictive patterns form because the body learns that certain states are intolerable. Stress, emptiness, fear, fatigue, or emotional pain become signals of danger. The behavior becomes a way to restore equilibrium. Over time, the nervous system stops trusting that these states can resolve on their own. Recovery begins when that trust is rebuilt. This is not philosophical, it is physiological. A nervous system that does not feel safe will search for control. It will narrow options. It will activate old solutions. It will prioritize certainty over growth. A nervous system that feels safe becomes flexible. It tolerates delay. It explores alternatives. It allows states to change without intervention. Safety in this sense does not mean comfort. It means the absence of threat. The body must learn that discomfort is not the same as danger. This learning does not occur through reassurance alone. It occurs through experience. Each time a person remains present during a difficult state, and nothing catastrophic follows, the nervous system updates. It learns that this internal condition is survivable. Each time an urge rises and falls without being acted on, the system records that the predicted outcome is not required. Each time a stressful event passes without collapse, the system recalibrates. These experiences build internal safety. They teach the body that it does not need to flee. This is why early recovery often feels exposed. The person is encountering states that were previously avoided. The body has no reference. It assumes threat. Recovery is not just stopping a behavior, it is expanding the range of states that can be tolerated. This expansion happens gradually. A person might first learn to sit with mild restlessness, then moderate anxiety, then boredom, then loneliness. Each level requires repeated exposure. The body does not leap. It adjusts in increments. This process is sometimes described as building distress tolerance. That phrase can sound abstract. In practical terms, it means learning that internal discomfort does not require immediate resolution. The nervous system learns through outcome. If discomfort rises and is followed by harm, the system strengthens avoidance. If discomfort rises and is followed by stability, the system weakens avoidance. Recovery is therefore a sequence of exposures to internal states in a context of relative safety. This is why environment matters. A person trying to relearn safety while living in constant chaos is working against the biology. The system cannot update if threat is continuous. Supportive conditions allow learning. Predictable routines reduce uncertainty. Consistent sleep stabilizes regulation. Regular meals prevent physiological stress. Movement discharges arousal. Human connection reduces threat signaling. These are not optional. They create the baseline from which learning can occur. Safety is not created by telling the body it is safe. It is created by repeatedly experiencing stability. Many people misunderstand this and believe that recovery should feel better quickly. When it does not, they assume something is wrong. In reality, recovery often feels worse before it feels better. The person is no longer numbing or escaping. The system is exposed. This does not mean that recovery is harmful. It means that the person is finally experiencing states that were previously avoided. The work is not to eliminate these states, it is to build capacity. Capacity grows through repetition. A person who has learned to escape at the first sign of discomfort may initially tolerate only seconds of an urge. That is enough. Seconds become minutes. Minutes become intervals. The nervous system learns. This learning is not about endurance. It is about updating prediction. The body stops treating the state as an emergency. This changes the meaning of the urge. It becomes a sensation rather than a command. The person can notice it without acting. This is not detachment, it is regulation. As safety increases, curiosity becomes possible. The person can begin to ask what the state represents. Is this hunger? Is this fatigue? Is this loneliness? Is this overstimulation? These questions are not philosophical. They guide action. The person learns to meet needs directly. Food instead of numbing hunger. Rest instead of suppressing fatigue. Connection instead of isolating. Movement instead of freezing. The nervous system begins to associate these responses with relief. This is how new loops form. Recovery therefore becomes less about resisting urges and more about responding to signals. The body is no longer treated as an enemy. It becomes a source of information. This shift is fundamental. Addiction teaches the system that signals are intolerable. Recovery teaches the system that signals are manageable. The person no longer lives in reaction. They live in response. This does not remove difficulty from life. It changes how difficulty is held. The person learns that they can be in pain without collapsing. They can be bored without escaping. They can be anxious without numbing. They can be tired without quitting. This learning builds resilience. Resilience is not toughness, it is flexibility. A resilient nervous system can move through states. It does not lock into one solution, it adapts. This adaptability is what addiction gradually removes. It narrows the range of possible responses. Recovery widens it again. This widening is not dramatic, it is cumulative. The person begins to notice small shifts. They pause before acting. They recover from stress more quickly. They feel less urgency. They tolerate more. These changes are often invisible to others. They are felt internally as space. Space between cue and action. Space between feeling and response. Space between impulse and identity. This space is safety. Not because nothing hurts, but because hurt does not dominate. The nervous system no longer believes that escape is the only path. It has learned that staying is possible. This is why recovery is not a single decision. It is a gradual re-education of the body. It does not end when a behaviour stops. It continues as long as the person encounters states that were once avoided. Each encounter is an opportunity. Each experience is a lesson. The body does not need perfection. It needs consistency. Over time, safety becomes internal rather than external. The person does not rely solely on structure or avoidance. They carry capacity. They know they can tolerate. They know they can wait. They know the wave will pass. This knowledge is not conceptual. It is embodied. It lives in heart rate patterns, muscle tone, breathing rhythms, and hormonal response. It is not a belief. It is a state. Recovery in this sense is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming someone whose nervous system is no longer organised around escape. It is about living in a body that trusts itself. This trust is not blind. It is earned. It is earned through thousands of small moments where discomfort appears and is survived. It is earned through repeated experiences of stability. It is earned through learning that internal weather changes without intervention. This is slow. It is also permanent, because once the body learns that it is safe to feel, it does not unlearn that easily. It carries that capacity forward. This does not mean that life becomes easy. It means that life becomes workable, and from that place, a different relationship with time, identity, and self becomes possible. one that is not defined by constant effort or vigilance, but by gradual return, which leads naturally into the final movement of this journey, where the question shifts from how to stop to how to live. Recovery is often imagined as a destination, a finish line, a moment when effort ends and ease begins. In reality, it is a return, not to who you were before the pattern formed, but to a version of yourself that can remain present without needing to escape. Addiction narrows life, it compresses experience, it teaches the nervous system that only a small range of states is tolerable, and only a narrow set of actions can resolve them. Over time, attention contracts, options disappear, the body becomes organized around avoiding discomfort rather than engaging with life. What recovery restores is not virtue or strength. It restores range. It returns access to more than one response. It allows discomfort to exist without immediately becoming a crisis. It allows pleasure to emerge from ordinary sources again. It allows the body to settle without interruption. This return does not happen all at once. It happens in fragments. A pause where there was none, a breath before action, a moment of noticing, a different choice made once, then twice. Each of these moments is small. None of them feel like transformation, but together they shift the internal landscape. The nervous system stops bracing. The body begins to trust that states can change without force. The mind no longer has to monitor every impulse. Life becomes less about management and more about participation. This is not a dramatic rebirth. It is a gradual re-entry. The person does not wake up cured. They wake up slightly more present. They notice the taste of food. They feel tired and rest. They feel anxious and wait. They feel bored and move. These actions are ordinary. They are also the foundation of change. The system learns that it can move through states without collapse. It learns that it does not have to flee. This learning is not heroic. It is repetitive. It happens in kitchens, on sidewalks, in beds, in quiet rooms. It happens in the absence of spectacle. The person is not proving anything. They are practicing living. This practice builds an internal sense of continuity. The self no longer feels like something that disappears under pressure. It remains. That continuity is what addiction interrupts. It fractures attention. It fragments experience. It pulls the person out of the present moment and into automatic loops. Recovery re-establishes continuity. The person begins to experience themselves across time rather than in bursts. They remember what they were doing. They follow through. They rest without vanishing. They engage without fleeing. This does not mean that life becomes calm. Stress still arises. Loss still occurs. Fatigue still happens. What changes is the relationship to these states. They're no longer treated as emergencies. They're treated as parts of experience. The body stops interpreting every deviation from comfort as threat. It becomes more tolerant, more flexible, more responsive. The person no longer has to be perfect. They have to be present often enough for learning to continue. Mistakes do not end the process. They become information. Each lapse reveals a vulnerability. Each vulnerability suggests an adjustment. The work becomes adaptive rather than punitive. This is how systems evolve. The person stops trying to defeat themselves. They begin to work with the organism they are. That organism is not broken. It learned something that once helped. It can learn something else. The nervous system is not loyal to harm. It is loyal to what works. When new ways of regulating become reliable, the old ones lose power, not because they are forbidden, but because they are no longer necessary. This is the deepest change. The person does not spend every day resisting. They spend more days simply living. The urge may still appear. It does not define the day. It becomes one event among many. The person returns to what they were doing. They do not revolve around the impulse. This is what freedom looks like at the biological level. Not the absence of desire, the presence of options, the ability to pause, the capacity to remain. Recovery is therefore not about erasing the past. It is about no longer being organized by it. The old learning remains in the nervous system. It no longer runs the system. The person carries memory without being driven by it. They remember without reliving. They feel without escaping. They act without fragmenting. This return is gentle because the body learns gently. Force creates threat. Threat strengthens old loops. Patience creates safety. Safety enables change. The person is not racing toward a better self. They're allowing a more complete self to emerge. This self is not ideal. It is functional. It can be tired and continue. It can be anxious and remain. It can be uncomfortable and not vanish. This is not perfection. It is stability. And stability is what addiction replaces with urgency. In recovery, urgency gives way to sequence. Days regain shape. Time becomes continuous. The person does not live in crisis. They live in process. This process does not end. It does not need to. It is not a project. It is a way of being in the body. The nervous system becomes a place that can be inhabited rather than escaped. That is the return. Not to innocence. Not to a past self. To the present one. The one that can stay. The one that does not disappear when life becomes difficult. The one that experiences states and moves through them. The one that does not need to be managed every moment. The one that trusts that the next state will arrive. This trust is not belief. It is biology. It is learned. And once learned, it becomes the quiet background of experience. Not dramatic, not heroic, simply present. From there, life continues, not without challenge, not without change, but with a body that no longer needs to run from itself, with a mind that no longer has to fight, with a nervous system that can rest inside its own experience. This is not the end of anything. It is the continuation of ordinary living without constant interruption, a return that does not announce itself, a way of being that becomes familiar, a life that does not require escape to be lived.